and welcome to this month's Self-Build Hour. As a reminder, I'm Jenny Chandela. I'm an architect with AC Architects and the lead of our Swindon office. And today we're once again recording from the NSBRC, the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre here in Swindon. And we're delighted to have you join us again. This Self-Build Hour was created for self-builders to provide a convenient means in the comfort of your own home or office to take a deep dive into a specific self-build topic. And we are joined today to be talking about structural site considerations. So as a reminder of logistics, we do have a Q&A function on this Teams call. You're more than welcome to type in your questions as you think of them during Paul's presentation. If you don't have access to that Q&A function, please do use the chat function. I will make sure that I am checking both of those throughout the course of his presentation and during our Q&A session. So following Paul's presentation, we will be taking those questions, and it's your opportunity for those of you who are attending live today to ask questions specifically about the material that is presented. This is recorded, so it will be available following the presentation so that you can revisit the information, or for anyone who didn't have the opportunity to attend with us live today, they can go back and revisit that information. So now, without further ado, I'm going to welcome our subject matter expert today, Paul Chambers. He's a structural design engineer with AC Structures, and together with the entire ACS team, he provides structural design services that are really aligned to meet the needs of self-builders. They're specific for that, and so self-builders who are looking to develop a low energy home. So they've got a lot of information about, how we like to see some of that detailing for low energy homes in order to minimize cold bridging. And he regularly advises self-builders on both the site and design choices. Today, we're going to speak specifically about those site choices. The groundworks is sort of the biggest unknown in your project. So if as much information as you can get, even before you buy the plot, is really useful. Please join me today for welcoming Paul to our Self-Build Hour. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Jenny. So as Jenny says, we're the sister company, AC Structures, to AC Architects, and today we're going to be talking about the early site review, which is one of the biggest unknowns, if not the biggest unknown, and possibly one of the sort of biggest losses that you can have on your project is pouring money in the form of concrete into the ground and not spending it on anything fun like kitchens and bathrooms. So we're going to try avoid some of that where you can. This can be for people who have bought a plot already, or if you're currently looking for a plot, or possibly just streamlining your design so that your plot foundations don't cost you an arm and a leg. So I'm just going to share my screen just now. So early site considerations, evaluating your site and getting the best value from your project. The best way to start this, if I can move, is covering what a typical engineer does. So engineering services typically are superstructure design, which your architect has already drawn up your drawings, your house has already been set. Then we would come in after that and pull together the structural engineering info. This is the way most engineering services work throughout the UK. You are going to need, as an engineer, to look at your site at some point. Every engineer is going to need to assess the ground one way or another to determine whether they're happy to take the liability and the design responsibility of your house sitting on top of that ground, but they don't necessarily need to do it at the beginning, which is a little bit of a shortfall, and because you can use that information from the start and work your way through your project with that on hand to advise the design. So Assessment of ground conditions and foundation design can be done quite early on at a preliminary level. You won't get your final foundation design because obviously you need to know what you're putting above it, but you can work with that information and make a start. Value engineering design, guidance and support is something that we offer at ACS and some other engineering companies will offer as well, but it's not often used to its full advantage. So for example, this is looking at your plot, your architect's design, and being able to advise how feasible this is for your budget, for your design, and any other constraints that you might have at the beginning. Not waiting until you've finished it, you've got all your warrant approvals and you're ready to build, and then finding out how much it costs. And then if you're in Scotland, SCR certification and submission for calculation and structural drawings to building warrant throughout the UK. So that's the typical engineering service we offer here. As I say, you're going to need to look at the ground at some point, but what we're trying to highlight here today is the earlier you look at this information, the better. So an early site review, this can be conditional on a purchase of a plot. This could be you've just picked up a plot and you've decided that you're going to be building on it. You're going to want to find out what you want to do before you run away with an architect's drawings. You can say in your head, you might already have picked a construction type. So I've met plenty of clients who already know I really want to go with SIPs. I really want to go with ICF, or I know a builder and I want to do this type of house. And that's great to have that kind of vision, but I think you want to check in with your plot and figure out whether you can actually do that or not. So stage one, I'll dive into each one of these points in a little bit more depth as we go through the presentation, but a stage one for us is a desktop evaluation of the site. So that's using all of our records that we can find online to see what we're anticipating to find. Specification would come from us based on these online findings as to what we think you should confirm. So this can vary. If you're doing an extension project, then typically the scope is a little simplified. It would be trial pits as opposed to a full-on borehole lab testing inspection. If you've got a very concise report on the plot that you've purchased or are looking to purchase online, say there's a road nearby with lots of borehole logs that we can identify and get a very good understanding of what's going to be on the plot, then again, it could be quite a simple site investigation. But if you do a desktop evaluation and find that there's a lot of risks identified, or if there's any unknowns, then you'd be looking at this sort of intrusive site investigation, which does add a little bit of cost to the early part of the design, but overall it's going to allow you to design efficiently from the start, and it'll save you cost as you go along. So I wouldn't be put off by it. Site visit and inspection, we would attend during that, and then you would review the site findings, provide them to you in a report, and then we want to outline what we think is the best process. If there's any constraints on your site, as I say, we would let you know at this point. We'd say, well, I would avoid doing this. For example, if you're on a sloped site, I would avoid building up without digging in, cut and fill, figuring out what your foundations are going to be before proceeding. Otherwise, this could be a big unknown cost. There's a lot of different examples, but I'll give you a few in here. These are some overviews of what we're looking at on the desktop study. So this is a radon review. This is superficial deposits on the ground, bedrock geology, coal mining openings, historic maps, and flood reports. Now, all of this is probably meaningless to you and quite confusing. It's just a page covered in colours. But what that highlights, and what the point I'm trying to make here, is that all this information's out there and is very useful if you know what to do with it. So we would be looking to combine all of this information and put it into a report format to give to you, which would typically look something like this, where we're going to recommend, okay, we've looked at all these different bits of information, some of it we can disregard, and other bits we want to highlight, and these are going to impact the design that you're either proposing, if you've already got a shape or a house that you want to put on it, or if you've got absolutely nothing, then we can start from there and say, okay, well, if you've got a blank slate, I wouldn't bother going with ICF, for example. It's going to be too heavy for this plot, or I would say you're going to need piles regardless, so you can go down whichever route you like. So this is typically what we would send out to you in the first instance before arranging a site visit, and then we would come down shortly after that to confirm our assumptions. This is a couple of pictures from a few site visits we've been on. So this is an extension project. You can see this is a fairly minimal intrusive inspection. We were just checking the depth of the existing foundations, as we're going to be tying into these with our new extension. And normally we're going to be able to do this quite simply and quite minimally. But if you've got a new plot, if it's on a brownfield site, for example, or a nice bit of new farmland, you're probably not going to have that much information on it. So you're looking at something like a intrusive borehole sample, which are taken here. Normally you're going to have a few taken across the site, and then you're going to take these back to the lab, get testing done on them, and you're going to have a much more accurate understanding of the different makeups of soil at different levels on the plot. This is then what we're going to base our design on and say, okay, you have a bearing capacity of, for example, 50 or 100 kilonewtons a meter squared, and then we can, and what level they're at, we can advise you whether a raft slab is feasible or if traditional strip foundations are feasible. Understanding these things and pulling them together, although it is not the most exciting thing in the world, it will determine the scope of your project. So the depth to suitable bearing strata, and what that means is you might have 500 mil, for example, of topsoil on top of your site that's completely useless for building on. That's fine, but what do you do with that? You're going to have to remove that. You're going to have to put it somewhere. You're going to pay to have it removed from the site, or are you going to redistribute it? How much are you going to have to pay to get rid of that? That could determine whether you went for an insulated raft slab foundation or a strip foundation on its own. Never mind thinking about the structural element. It could simply just come down to the amount of cut and fill that you have to do on site and the amount of soil you're going to have to take out, which direction you get steered down there. You're also going to be looking at what foundations you can use based on the bearing capacity. So if it is clay, for example, you might be looking at either traditional strip. You could be looking at trench fill if the clay at good bearing is much deeper, or you could be looking at raft foundations combined with a cut and fill. They're all going to be a balance between cost, your design intent, and the design. But if you don't know what these parameters are, then it can be tricky to design to efficiently. And that just comes back to what type of design and construction type suits your site. So picking this information up early on will allow you to decide as you go forward. So I won't have enough time today to go through every example. As you've seen from the colourful pictures at the beginning, there's a lot of different variations, there's a lot of different types, but the ones that come up the most for us are slope sites and sites with high volume change potential and trees. They come up quite a lot, and there's a few different ways to approach both of them. Sloped sites typically are more cost efficient to pick up. There's quite a few of them around because they are going to be a headache, but if you're planning for that ahead of time, then you can take advantage of this situation. So are you going to use a structural retaining wall? So that would give you a basement or a half basement where you're cut into the hill. If you're going down the route of ICF, this can be quite a cost efficient way to get square meterage in your home and buy a cheaper plot. If you're not doing that and you're landscaping it and cutting it out, do you have enough space to step back a retaining wall and put a retaining wall out with the perimeter of the building and build a kit on the inside? If you're doing that, what are you building it out of? So masonry retaining walls, you can typically get up to 1.2 meters in height with these for a reasonable cost. Gabion basket walls, you can go as high as 5 meters, but again, lower than that for a reasonable cost. Reinforced concrete walls, there's a lot of different options for that. If you're going down the ICF route but didn't want the basement, you can often get the ICF contractor to do your reinforced concrete retaining wall at the same time as the house. These are all things that you would need to plan ahead for before confirming what type of kit you're going to do and confirming what the design is. And this just comes back to the same question again, as what type of design are you going for, and then what construction type suits the site. If you're on a sloped site, I'm thinking that you're either going with, if you're on a gradual slope, you step it back and you landscape it out if you can, prior to getting the engineer, the architect involved. Or you're going to be going with a small retaining wall and a flat kit. If you're on a very steep site, you're looking at basements, infill, and again, these are all kind of expensive things, but they're a big part of the budget, so plan ahead for them and know what you're going to do at the beginning. Volume change in trees is probably the most common one because we've got a lot of clay through the UK, so clays can vary in their volume change potential, but quite often if they're high, you're going to have to evaluate the roots, the amount of water near your site, and what the potential for change in settlement. This is when you start to see cracking at lintels over time if you're to do this wrong. So figuring out what trees you have on your site by doing topographical surveys, first getting the lay of the land, followed by tree surveys will give you an idea of what you've got and how far away you want to be. If you've not set out your site and you have quite a lot of land to work with, then we can advise you as to how far away you might want to be from a certain tree to avoid the influence of it. They do range quite far. Some big trees can have sort of 25-meter, 30-meter radius of influence and volume change. These are not something that you can skip around. We've had clients say, well, what if I just cut it down before you start works? Well, the roots are going to take, some of them can take up to 10 years to die off. So if you chop it down and think you're saving yourself the hassle before getting us involved, I would advise against that, because over the course of sort of 5 to 10 years, you might start to find that it settles and cracks after that. So site planning cost, figure out where your trees are, what you've got. If you've got big ones, you chop them down or not, they're still going to have an influence, that's fine, but you can plan ahead for it. You can say, okay, here are the options for the foundations we're going to go with. If you're trying to go down the route of, say, a passive house or a passive principle designed house, this is important because you don't want to leave this down to the later end and find out that your insulated raft slab detail that you wanted doesn't work. And that could blow your passive certification out of the water straight away. So planning for that and setting it out on site in such a way that still allows you to get that passive certification is quite important. Some of the options for this and high volume change, here's a few sort of cuttings from other projects we've had. This is a suspended slab. It's suspended on a ring beam off of pad foundations with a compressible void filler underneath. So this allowed a insulated above SIPS kit, insulated above the slab, so cold slab beneath, with a compressible filler underneath to take care of that volume change. This was a high volume change site. Your next one would be trench fill. This will get you down to greater depths and it'll get you away from some of the roots. Again, if you're on a root protected site, you can't do that in certain areas. But if you're on a hill, this means you can get down and away and create root barriers and root protection zones so that they can't get underneath your house and cause movement. And then again, a more typical way to do this on a poorly graded site would be pile foundations and then an insulated raft slab above. This is an example where you want to be going for a raft slab for your thermal efficiency. However, you're going to have to then break some thermal gaps where you're joining your pile foundations, which is not great for your thermal efficiency. And if you hadn't accounted for that ahead of time, it's going to come as a little bit of a surprise. So you're going to want to know what that bearing strata is at the beginning. It's only really at this stage that you can start to pair this with your architect's design. So I've got a couple of slides here that are a little bit ahead of your plot review, but what they highlight is how the design of the house influences the foundations that you're going to be sitting on. So build types, most common ones we deal with right now would be ICF, SIPS, timber frame. SIPS and timber frame being the lighter of the three here, but working fundamentally slightly different. SIPS, you will find that you might have a lot larger spans, a lot bigger openings with vaulted ceilings, And in turn, it'll mean that you've transferred a lot of the loads to localized points. So you might have more point loads within this build than your typical timber frame. ICF, on the other hand, is heavy all over, but you might find that you've got a uniformly distributed bit of weight around the outside of the pad. So if you were going with an insulated raft slab, for example, this might be okay if you've got good bearing strata at a high level on your site and you're not having to dig out too much. This is an example here of 4 kits. They're all SIPS kits. They're all the same house. They're all 220 square meters, but they have some slight changes to them. So this blue overmark here shows steel structure within the kit. What I'm trying to point out here is that you've basically got the same house, you've got the same plot, say for example, but you've redistributed the weight in several different ways. So in this one, they're all timber walls, they're all SIPS walls on the outside, they're all uniformly distributed, but what that means is your design that you've worked on with your architect has small closed off rooms, not large open plan spaces at the lower level. Whereas if you're to take all the walls out on the lower level here, you've concentrated about half of the building on 2 points in the north and south on 2 columns, which will be taken down to your foundations. And in this case, they're put on pad foundations. But if you've not got great bearing strata or you have a variable soil structure across your site, this could be quite expensive. So knowing what you've got on bearing strata before you start this design process will lend you some choices that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to make. This is one of them. So this is a compromise where they've put half of a wall in and still got some open plan space, but it means they've not got as many concentrated point loads as they might have done before. And then if you're looking at the concentrated fully open one, you'll find that you've got a lot more steel framing and to be taken down to the founds. And it's worth saying with all of this that none of this is to put you off or to highlight anything that can't be done. Everything when it comes to ground can be done, but it's a balance of at what cost. If you know that your foundations are going to come in at 40 grand and you float to us an initial sketch or an idea that I can say, yeah, that looks fairly reasonable, then you can be happy with that. Or if your foundation, you find that your ground conditions are really poor, but you still want a glazed gable end or you still want open plan living, then you can start to budget in and add an extra 10,000–15,000 pounds into this or more, and just be aware that it's going to happen before you get to site and find out when your contractor starts digging that you're going to need to pay all this money. So here's an overview of a project that was put on site. We've done an early stage 2 review paired with a stage 1 review. So we've evaluated the site and we've evaluated the architect's proposed plans. What that has allowed us to do is to give you an idea of distributing the loads, show you how it's all going to come together. And this means the client was able to start getting quotations in for groundworks before they've finished the full project, and they can start getting a better idea of the budget, how their project's actually going to sit in the land, whether it was feasible or not, before they got all the way through the process and had to wait to the very end. That is a very quick overview from me on the early design considerations. I think the biggest takeaway here would be evaluating it as soon as you can. This is something that we do quite a lot at ACS. If you have any sort of plots that you're looking to purchase, or if you've already purchased, we'd be happy to do a stage 1, which would be looking at the desktop study and then advising you on the site investigation type that you might have to go down the line. That doesn't mean that we have to do all of that in a oneer. We simply just do the desktop study, give you our advice, and you can come back to it at a later date. Same with the stage 2. If you've got drawings or if you're starting to look at drawings on your plot, then we'd be happy to pair up both of those and do them in a oneer. Just whatever suits you. But I think the most important bit is get the information as early as you can so that you can put that towards your design and advise your design going forward.
Thank you very much, Paul. Much appreciated. So there was a lot of information there about the ground, obviously, because that's the focus. And I guess one question that comes to mind is, for people who maybe did get scared of some of the information about what could potentially be in the ground. Are there any? Have you ever seen from the initial site evaluation something that's come back and it's just been such a big red flag that you wouldn't even consider developing on the plot? Is there anything like that? Where are all of these things that you can work with?
Yeah, I mean, you can pretty much work with anything. I've seen site investigations come back where I personally wouldn't build on the plot because I've not got the stomach for it or the budget. But we've had clients say, no, this is the plot we want, this is the design we want. And then at that point, we start getting other third-party contractors involved. We get other experts involved. And the project I'm thinking of would be on the bank of a river. A very soft ground. It was going to need pile foundations. They were aware that that was going to be a significant cost, but they were willing to push through that and do it. And it's on site now, still getting built, but it is a significant change to the design and a significant amount of cost. But it's just knowing these things before you start. Take the unknown out of it. And in that instance, they were still willing to go ahead. I've not seen any where people have done a site evaluation and thought, okay, well, I'm going to write it off. We've done a couple of site evaluations for people who haven't quite bought a plot yet. They've had a look at it. Some of them could be okay, not great, but they've never normally been the reason why the purchase hasn't gone through or anything like that. It's simply just being able to put it into a spreadsheet and have that as a part of the overall budget, instead of leaving it as a big question mark when you start pricing up kits and contractors and things.
Absolutely. And I think probably the example of building on a riverbank, anyone probably, that is something that is always going to be higher risk from a flood standpoint, ground condition standpoint. So if those people who are listening today, weren't aware of that, that is something that is probably a site to look out for. A steeply sloping site, as you've mentioned, can be challenging, but it can also provide a lot of opportunities for people who are looking to get a piece of land that maybe no one else wants to get. So where those plots of land exist that can be a bit more challenging, they can provide a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, it's the same when it comes to trees. We've seen site evaluations for plots where there's loads and loads of trees, and traditional builders don't want to take these because it's not within their remit. So they can't go in and do a simple 600 mil strip foundation, pop up a house, sell it and move on to the next one. So these plots will get left and they'll sit for a long period of time. But if you're to come along with an open-minded approach to it and say, okay, there's loads of trees, they're protected, there's root protection zones, but you want to go down the route of screw piles and ring beams around the top, and you're open to the shape of the design of the house, you can get a bargain there and you can make something work with that. But your project's probably going to be a lot slower. You're going to have to be a bit more flexible, and you're kind of going to have to roll with the punches a bit. But these are options that are out there, and it's a good way to get a good deal on a plot. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you can't do it blind. You can't just buy it and expect it to be okay.
And along that sort of conversation path about trees, are there any trees that have more intrusive root systems than others that people could?
Yeah, they do vary a lot. The one that's probably the most interesting and the most common one would be hawthorn hedges. You see them dotted around a lot of property boundaries. It's something that's quite common throughout the UK. They have quite a significant root network, and they have a high volume change. They do drink a lot of water. There's a lot of, obviously, your big trees. If you're looking at large oak trees and things like that, they obviously stand out. But the hedges are one that I think fly under the radar when I would ask a client at initial consultation, is there any trees? Are there any significant growth on site? And they would say, oh, no, nothing really, just a couple over here and there. And then when you start looking at the site, you see that it's completely bordered in hedgerows that have got a significant amount of water demand in them, then that can have a big impact. So I would look out for that one. But tree by tree, they all differ slightly. Some will be completely fine, and others can be very thirsty. So you can find all that kind of guidance online. We can share all of that. If you've got a plot and you want to look at a tree and you know what it is, then you can figure out how much of an impact it's going to be.
Right. And what about, you mentioned that hot tree can still have a root system that influences the ground conditions, and that can be for a period of time. If someone, a lot of times a vendor of a plot of land might put forward a planning permission, a speculative planning permission, in order to make the property more saleable. And perhaps in doing that, they cleared some of the trees from the plot. Is there some way that you look out for that? Do you just, when you do your initial site visit, look out for potential tree stumps on the plot, or is there some way to guard against that?
There is a little bit. So historic maps are probably one of the best ones for it. Getting a good idea of the lay of the land. You'll see them dotted on there. Not drawn very well, but you'll get an idea. And then if you're looking at an on-site investigation, by the time we come down to site, we'll be able to have a look about and see that. They would normally also get picked up in surveys. If other people are out there doing topos and doing tree surveys, they might find existing ones that are put out. But we're also not designing things to the wire, where if we've missed one tree that's been there, say 5 years ago, and it's still deteriorating, you're not going to find that your house is going to crack or settle from that. It's just if you've got a significant amount of them, or any that are very large and very close. I think you can also consider new planted trees. We have to put in a contingency for that, because once you've built the house, you might sell it, someone else could buy it, and then decide to plant a load of new trees around the property. You have to account for that as well. So there is a contingency in it, but I would also try find as much of it as possible.
There's a question here about protecting a land purchase subject to these site investigations. And I know from an architectural standpoint, we often have clients who might put in a pre-application inquiry in order to that's subject to the result of that is subject to the sale. So they'll put a deposit on the purchase. And we've got, but that's a sort of a 4 to 6 week time frame. How long do these types of early stage 1 site investigations take for you to get that best top information back to the client? So if they wanted to put in a purchase offer subject to that.
Yeah, so it's basically just working off of our timescales right now. If you were to ask me to carry one out just now, we've probably got 3 weeks until our nearest availability. Take me a day or so to get through it all and get a report back to you. So I would say 3 to 4 weeks. If you are going to include after that, if I look into it and say, oh, it's got the concerns for mining reports, it's got concerns for the variable ground conditions, and I recommend boreholes or something like that. If you're going to then go get a mining report done, and you're then going to go get boreholes done as well, you'd have to account for that time, and they can take another 3 weeks or so after that. But typically, well, I don't think I've ever seen that happen. Normally, it's always just a desktop study, and then if you're going to go further than that and decide to purchase it, we'll carry out the remaining required reports once you've got the land. But the desktop study itself doesn't take very long to carry out and evaluate. It's just fitting into our work schedule.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure. I haven't seen any additional questions come in. So if anyone has any additional questions, this is the opportunity to ask those. But I think this has been really useful to understand. So, I think everyone sort of looks at a plot of land and they imagine the design. and what could be there in terms of the views, in terms of some of the obvious landscape features. But there's a lot in the ground and a lot that can influence it. And I was talking to a client today, actually, about getting groundworks quotations, but actually you can't get, the groundworkers typically won't price things until you have a detailed design layout or some sort of structural information. So that layout that you showed within the presentation was really helpful to be able to do that sort of right after planning. If you've got all the ground information, then you can go out and sort of get really more than ballpark, better than ballpark figures on those ground rules to tie it down. Oh, I did have another question come in that said, how much should I budget for a structural engineer? So I think maybe it would be helpful, since we're talking about early design considerations, to talk about the overall cost of a structural engineer for an entire design project on average. But also, if someone just wanted to come to you and get an early site investigation done or a desktop study done, what range of costs are they looking at for that?
Yeah, so for an overall project from start to finish, so including your stage 1 sort of site evaluation, a stage 2 evaluation of your architect's drawings, and the full structural design pack, you'd be looking somewhere between 1% to 2% of your overall build cost. They're not percentage-based fees, they are all flat rate fixed fees, but that's just typically where they fall in at and the grand scheme of things. So that they're not large fees, and structural engineers are by no means the most expensive professional service you're going to have on the job. But you do need to account for it. And I think you do need to include that in there. You can scrimp out quite easily and avoid doing a stage 1. You don't have to do an early design review of the site. You don't have to do an early design review of your kit or your design. But what I would warn you of is that when you if you jump straight to appointing your engineer, once you've finished everything, you're likely going to pay a lot more than that to make it work and shoehorn it into a site and figure it out after, as if you just looked at it in the first place and avoided it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, often there's, for good reason, there's a hesitation to sort of spend money on professional fees until you've de-risked the project as much as you can. But I think it's really important to remember that the ground conditions can be, a cost associated risk within the project. So you'll be paying for that ground survey one way or the other, whether it's in those early investigations plus an efficient design, or it's later on in the build when actually now you're tied into a design and you don't have an as efficient route to that ground design.
Yeah, quite often it comes up when you start excavating on site. You start digging, your builder will have said, oh, we can do this, that, or the next thing. I've done one down the road and this is how we done it there. And you say, oh, that's great. And you'll start digging it out and it'll start, say the walls of the trenches will start falling in, or you'll find soft spots or water. And then you're going to have to now start to add, okay, now we have to pay for shoring. Now we have to pay for trench fill. Now we have to pay for pumping water out of trenches on site. And none of this could be costed in before because it may or may not have been included. But if you knew that you were going to be falling into one of these categories where this ground isn't going to stand up to a trench fill dig, then you could just say, okay, let's not do that. Let's do pads. How does that work? And then you'll be able to cost it from the start. On you go.
I was just going to say, you had made a comment about the builder saying, oh, I've done this down the road. We don't have the SER process in England the way Scotland does. So that tends to happen more frequently here than maybe it does in Scotland. I'm just wondering if the ground worker says that they can just design the foundation, why couldn't but can't they do that and just lump it into the cost of your overall build rather than having an additional professional service?
You can, and there's plenty of them that can do it. It's just you're going to have to find a builder that you really trust, and you're going to have to watch how it's all worded. If they're saying, okay, they're going to design it, they're taking the liability for it, and they're going to design these foundations and install them no matter what they find on site. Okay, fine, if you get a good deal for that, but you've still not de-risked the fact that in a couple of years' time, 10 years' time, you start to get lintel cracks, you start to get settlement in your house. Who are you holding accountable for that, and how do you do the remedial works on it if you don't really know what the builders designed or installed in the first place? I think the other problem with that is what are they basing their design on? I mean, experience is obviously important, and that's one thing, and a lot of these builders that you'll bump into that do these kinds of things, they've got loads of experience, they understand that, that's fine, but I don't think they'll have the same sort of technical background to it, and they might not find the most cost-efficient solutions to some tricky problems. A lot of the approach is often just to throw more concrete at it, whereas the reality is there's probably a better, simpler solution that if you'd known from the start, you could have got around it. But once you've started, you're kind of in it now, so you just have to keep going. And on the cost of an initial stage one that you'd asked about, if you're looking at just a desktop study, I mean, there are only a couple of £100 for doing the desktop part. They'll vary when it starts to include site visits. If we're doing a day's travel and overnight flights and such, they can go to about 1,000, up to 2,000 if we're out for a decent bit. But they're not a significant portion, and just the desktop part and a bit of a report advice is minimal, a couple £100.
And I guess based on, I mean, the clues of the name, it's a desktop study. So effectively, any professional who has the resources to look up that information through the databases can do it regardless of proximity to the plot.
Yeah, exactly. And even on that, I can give you all the links and the information yourself if you want to look at it. But I think that's useful for you to get a ballpark idea. But I think getting a professional's opinion on combining that data and what it all means when you pair it together and being able to advise you on that information is the bit that you're really paying for. Some of the sites have paid access barriers, but they're not a lot. And I think once you get through that, it's more the advice and the recommendations that you want to go with.
And then there was a question that comes through that's a bit beyond early design considerations, but since we have you here, the benefit of a structural engineer, I'll ask it anyway. Someone has a kit supplier who says that they've included the structural engineer for the superstructure. Is there anything else that they need to consider? Is there a reason that they would want to get that validated or grouped up with other structural engineering services, or is that pretty much all they need anyway?
Yeah, so kit engineering, we do this we work on both ends of this scale quite often. So we will either just engineer the kit, or we will engineer everything out with the kit. So your kit engineers will quite often just include the superstructure and nothing else. If you have, when we're just thinking about the structural aspect, if you're thinking any staircases that were follow-on trades, balustrades, handrails, barriers, any fixings to the outside of the building. So if you have a canopy or any overhangs, cladding, masonry outer leaf, any sort of second fix item won't be covered by that. If you're in Scotland, you will need that for SCR guarantees. If you're in England, it's not a lot of these elements aren't necessarily required. But again, if you get them designed, that will save you a lot of time and hassle. The one that comes to mind would be handrails and balustrades and staircases. If you don't have one decided, but maybe in your mind you're thinking, I want a nice floating tread stair, or I want a glass balustrade where you can't see any of the spindles or rails. If you've not communicated that to a principal engineer out with the kit engineer is likely not to include the structure to support that. they're just going to be looking at the structure to support their kit and their sort of piece of the pie. You're going to need an overall engineer to evaluate that and put together, well, here's the support for this bespoke item that you want to fit. Again, deciding that and knowing that before you start to build is the cheaper way to do it. If you then complete the build, then you go to put the staircase in, find out it doesn't work, and you start doing things backwards, doing remedial works to make things work. It becomes a lot trickier and a lot more expensive. So there are a lot of things that you're going to need to cover. I mean, other bits out with the superstructure that you would want engineering for, obviously foundations we spoke about today, but drainage or any civils works. So if you've got a remote plot, road access, drainage for that, drainage to any retaining wall structures, retaining walls themselves. Drainage for your plot and how you're fixing your house to either existing mains, or if you're doing treatment facilities, soakways, these kinds of things are all something that we can cover as an encompassing package. But if you've already got your kit engineer, then you would keep the kit engineering with them.
And it would be the principal engineer that would sort of coordinate everything and provide that level of oversight for it.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I'm just going to close with a few of the top takeaways that I've been noting down. I'll start with sort of the purpose of a preliminary desktop study. So that preliminary desktop study will provide the early information you need about the available potential construction types and the foundation options that are related to the influences of your specific ground conditions. The later stage, or still early stage, but later on in the process, the follow-up ground investigation will confirm those early assumptions that were uncovered within the desktop study, and it will help you begin to guide the groundwork's cost assumptions, as well as giving you better and further information about the foundations and options you have in terms of construction types. If we mentioned this a few times, if you're willing and able to accept a more challenging site, you may be able to get or negotiate a better deal on that particular plot because it's more challenging for a developer or another self-builder. And finally, a reminder that trees still influence even after they've been cut down. So it's the root systems, and it's the amount of root systems based on what Paul clarified that really can influence the soil's conditions on your site. So thank you very much for joining us today. We do always have in-person opportunities for you as well. We have at Sandown Park in Surrey coming up the end of this month, the Home Building and Renovating Show. That's a great opportunity for anyone who hasn't been to an HBR show to see what they're like and to attend the talks. Alan will be there giving talks as well as offering expert advice at the help desk. We also in July, at the beginning of July, have our How to Self-Build Successfully seminar that's taking place here at the NSBRC in Swindon. That is a full-day program where we have several subject matter experts invited along to talk to you about sort of the beginning to end, an overview of what you should expect within your self-build. And finally, an invitation to join us again next month. We will be joined by Andy Stevens. He's going to be talking to us about how to select and manage your builders on site. So many of you as self-builders will be considering a self-managed role within your project. And this is a great way to get insights on how you find those builders and how you work directly with them. So I look forward to seeing you next month. Join us for that. It is the 10th of July, I believe is the Thursday. And once again, 1 o'clock via Teams, and we'll send out additional information. Hope to see you there. Thank you.